Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. I apologize for the brief delay in getting started here this morning. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at Stimson, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this morning. Candidate Trump, throughout the campaign, spent a significant portion of his time criticizing the Obama administration, both for the Iran deal itself and for not doing more to defeat ISIS. Although his position and the administration's position on the Iran deal remains fluid, we know that the president has now offered more troops on the ground in the battle to retake and indeed retain Mosul. And although we've seen, I think, some positive signs for the future in the region, the security situation clearly remains quite fluid, and so it is a great pleasure for us, and indeed a timely one, that we welcome the ambassador from Iraq to share some thoughts with us this morning and kick off, I think, what will be a more wide-ranging conversation on the situation across the region. Before we turn to the ambassador, however, I do want to thank our partner in this event and in others to follow, the Trends Institution, and in particular my friend and colleague, the president of Trends, Ahmed El-Hamli. We will hear from his colleague Richard Burchell shortly on the panel that will follow. Really my only job is to turn quickly the dais over to my predecessor, Ellen Lapson. For those of you who focus on the Middle East, and I suspect that is everyone in this room, I think you will agree that there are few people in Washington that bring such balance and breadth of knowledge to Middle Eastern issues than does our distinguished fellow and President Emeritus Ellen Lapson. And so with that, Ellen, welcome back to the Stimson stage.
Thank you, Brian, and it really is a delight to be back at Stimson and with our friends, Dr. Hamli and Richard from Trends in Abu Dhabi. So we're happy to continue the collaboration on topics of great importance. So just to add a little bit to Brian's framing, I think for quite some time the conversation in Washington has a little bit linked Syria and Iraq as the battlefields in the campaign against the Islamic State. But I think we're at a good moment where we should separate those two stories and try to talk about Iraq in its own right. Your Prime Minister visited recently, and that was a good opportunity to think a little bit more productively about the U.S.-Iraq agenda going forward, and we were very happy that our friends in the Gulf thought it was also important to talk about Iraq's stability and how it affects the region as a whole. I'm really delighted to have my good friend Fareed Yassin, the new ambassador of Iraq in Washington, join us today. Fareed and I, we think we go back to the mid-90s when he was part of the Iraqi opposition. The Iraqi opposition, I was on the NSC staff, and he was part of delegations of Iraqi opposition trying to get the attention of the Clinton administration to do more to get rid of Saddam Hussein, as I recall, at the time. But he's most recently been ambassador to France, and I'm not going to ask you where the food is better in your two assignments. But before that, he liberated Iraq. He was on the policy planning staff. He also brings a deep science background, as many of Iraq's most senior leaders have historically. He's a PhD in physics from MIT.
No. From the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology.
Okay. But a postdoc at MIT. So a distinguished academic career before he moved into politics and now into diplomacy. So Fareed, let's just start with the sort of broad brush of what was achieved during the Prime Minister's visit. How do you see Iraq's story as the U.S.-Iraq relationship, but also what was the Prime Minister's message about Iraqi stability during his recent visit here?
Well, thank you, Ellen. Thank you for inviting me to this session. Thank you all for attending, especially you journalists. I have to tell you that during the 1990s, without the support of journalists, we would not have had the attention of the Clinton administration. Perhaps I should back up a little and put this more in more global context. America's attitude towards Iraq has always been to do things wrong than to do things a little better. Okay? And I still am of the opinion that the cardinal sin that was committed vis-a-vis Iraq was not the 2003 war, although much is to be said about that, but rather that the 91 war was not prosecuted in a way that should have brought better closure to not only Iraq, but to the entire area. Hence our activism, hence, you know, had you done that, we would have never met. So, anyway, there's a restart. I mean, Iraq, always, I think that there are, you know, key moments in the history of Iraq. One was the fall of Mosul, and these were dark days, and it was a really real existential threat. And in fact, we rose. I think that the Iraqi political body rose to the occasion of help allies. You know, we're really back from the brink, and we're about to fully close this chapter. I always say, you mentioned the Clinton administration earlier. We've, as Iraqis since 2003, we've dealt with a Republican administration that was somewhat ideological, and then reality prevailed. And then after that, we dealt with a Republican, Democratic administration that was arguably perhaps more ideological, and then reality prevailed. And then there was a new administration, and we wanted to get acquainted with it, but as it, you know, all signs are that reality is prevailing. Iraq and America have been intertwined for over 25 years now, and so it was really important that our leaderships get acquainted to map the road ahead, which is critical importance not only to us but also to the region and to the United States. ISIS is not only a threat to Iraq but also to, as everybody knows, the entire world. And so it was critical for us to get our leaderships together. Prime Minister Badi was one of the first to call the president to congratulate him on his election and after his inauguration. And I'm happy to say that he was the first Arab leader to be received in the White House and to have a meeting with the American leadership. And in fact, we're actually, in terms of Washington, I'm probably the happiest Arab ambassador here, because in the White House, I count many friends, people who have worked and spent much of their life and blood, in fact, in Iraq, and I think who have a stake in its success and in our continued good relationships. We have a framework for this relationship. In 2008, we signed 2 agreements with the United States. One was a status of forces agreement that expired in 2011, and I don't want to discuss that. We can talk about it during the question and answer period if you want, but we had a much broader strategic framework agreement, which I think encapsulate better the relationship we have with the United States now more than before. And one has to say a very important thing is that we are now prosecuting the war with the help of the United States. There are American troops on Iraqi soil, but they are there at their request and in support of the Iraqi government. That's a radically different thing from the situation prior to 2011. To go forward, we will need more from the United States than just military support. That definitely will be needed in terms of training, in terms of the equipment. But we have to ensure, stability of the regions that will be liberated, and that's something that I know the Prime Minister cares very much about. And we will need to, in some sense, rev up our economy so that the Iraqis of all communities develop a sense of ownership, both of the political process and the economic process. And there, I think the American experience is very important for us. I mean, 2 things I'll mention to you. People have been talking about the fact that we have a popular mobilization that has now been folded into the Iraqi military infrastructure. But at some point, they'll be demobilized. Well, one of the countries that has the best experiences in demobilization is the United States. And it has an experience that has transformed its demobilized soldiers and officers into forces for the economy with the GI Bill. I think we could benefit from your experience to develop an Iraqi GI Bill for our soldiers. And another example that I could mention, I mean, the returned soldiers from the Second World War benefited from, you know, housing developments, you know, so-called leather towns. So we have a huge housing shortage in Iraq that needs to be fulfilled. We have soldiers in houses, and so the experience of leather towns that we developed right after the Second World War. And might I remind you that the President of the United States is a real estate developer. It's something that, although you know,
I'm trying to avoid those conflicts of interest for him.
Well, you know, but he can give advice. That would be welcome. That would be really welcome. And so, to plan for this visit of the Prime Minister, we have to cover all sorts of aspects, government to government, but also to set the stage for enhanced economic cooperation. So, for example, we sandwiched the meeting, I shouldn't use that word, but the meeting at the White House was preceded by meetings with CEOs of major American corporations, and then it was followed by a speech at the American Enterprise Institute, which I urge you to go and listen to. It's available online. And then after that, we had a meeting at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which I'm really happy to report had double the number of participants that we had at the Prime Minister's previous visit. It was really standing room only. And as a token of the United States' interest in developing the Iraqi economy, I'm really happy to note that Secretary of Commerce, Mr. Wilbur Ross, was present both at the meeting at the White House and also at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce event. So we're looking at a relationship that is broad, not only focused on military issues. We have a couple thousand American Iraqi students in the United States. It would be wonderful if we could expand that more. We're looking for investment in Iraq, and certainly American companies can help us diversify our economy, which unfortunately to date is still far too dependent on the export of oil. The oil industry itself could be diversified with the help of American companies. And I'm proud to say they're showing real interest, and I actually know this because I deliver visas. You know, so many of you who want to go to Iraq.
Thank you, Fareed. No, and we at Stimson were monitoring the implementation of the Strategic Framework Agreement for quite some time. You know, cooperation in education, in public health, in environment. The Iraqis had a very ambitious agenda for all the ways they wanted to tap into American know-how and American expertise. I know in the early years, one of the problems of implementation was that either on the Iraqi side, the positions were not filled, something that I would say we are experiencing ourselves of having senior jobs in government not yet filled. So that it was a little bit hard to keep the cabinet or sub-cabinet level, you know, annual or biannual meetings going. But I'm glad to hear that some of those civilian activities are now back in the front, in the forefront. So as we've been watching this Mosul campaign, which I think is understood to be virtually existential for Iraq. Iraq has to recapture the city, and we know that we at least accept the judgment that ISIS is in strategic decline, let's say. It's not completely annihilated as an organization, but it will pop up in different ways. But for its control of Iraqi territory, the trend line is what we would want to see. But the campaign in Mosul is in itself creating both political and humanitarian problems for Iraq. And we are reading lately about whether the Iraqi government was first encouraging civilians to stay in place, saying we'll protect you, so don't flee. And now what you're seeing still is spontaneous out-migration of civilians. And in particular, because northern Iraq is a place of more cultural and ethnic diversity, I would like you to address a little bit how is the conversation in Baghdad, I realize you don't live in Baghdad, but how is the conversation among Iraqi national authorities addressing the sort of reconciliation with Sunnis, the ability to keep Iraq's minorities feeling that they are still part of the Iraqi experience. We see reports of the out-migration of Christians who are unlikely to return to Iraq at this point. I know that when the Prime Minister spoke at the U.S. Institute of Peace, which of course has itself tried to do some of the bottom-up reconciliation work at the level of communities, et cetera, could you speak a little bit to is there a national plan for sort of peace at home, for a greater sense of political stability and reconciliation at home?
Definitely, and it's something that I can assure you the Prime Minister's thinking about from the beginning. And I'll relate an anecdote if you'll allow me. In 2014, September 2014, the French president decided to host a conference in support of Iraq and decided to fly to Baghdad and then to invite Iraqi decision makers to go to the conference. And then he met with Haider Abadi. I was part of that trip. And I know Haider Abadi is a parliamentarian and the head of the Economic Committee of Parliament, but I had never seen him as Prime Minister. He had just been appointed. And along walks in, and I can't say this, he actually spoke forcefully about his disappointment that red lines weren't respected, and but that he was relieved that progress could be made regarding Syria. I don't remember the exact details, but one thing that I remember was that Haider Abadi disagreed with him, and I thought that was really interesting, because here you have the president of a P5 country, nuclear power, and then you have this guy who has just been appointed prime minister of a country, half of which is occupied, and his army shambles, and he says, "I disagree with you," and I think he was right. Anyway, so it was about ISIS, and the follow-up point is the one in which he said that ISIS is not the problem. We will get rid of ISIS, but the real issues come afterwards. We will have to rebuild. We will have to recuperate, save our country by rebuilding it, and we don't have the resources. And so I would be very happy if you could devote that conference that you're setting up to calling for the establishment of a fund devoted entirely to earmarked to the regions that will be liberated. So he's been thinking about that ever since then. Now, this is an ongoing process. I mean, the first thing we have to do is deprive ISIS of territory, and this is something that we're doing. But then, they're going to transform themselves into, I think, a terrorist organization, like they were before. So they rose up the hill, moving from a terrorist organization to an insurgency, to controlling territory, to being the proto-state, and now we're driving them down. And as we drive them down, the tools that we'll require to deal with them are going to change from being military focus to security intelligence, which has implications on our relationship with our allies and the focus of our collaboration with them. But clearly, the first phase that we'll have to do after areas are liberated is to stabilize them. If you don't do that, you won't be able to have returnees. And I'm glad to report that there, in many cities, Tikrit, Mosul, there are significant numbers of returnees, and I think I would urge you to look at a number numbers in a report that was just issued by the International Organization for Migration, which lists this in great detail. In truth, the fear of the Iraqi government was that we would have a much larger number of displaced people in Mosul. They were talking of 500,000 to 1 million. Right now, the numbers that are listed by IOM are about 400,000. Still a huge number.
They report the problems that these people encounter that prevent them from returning are access to resources, in other words, money to buy food, in other words, jobs, and their houses. Okay. But there is a large number of returned people, and in fact, life is beginning to pick up. I mean, one of the most heartening things that you can see in Mosul itself are girls going back to school. That's a game changer, for people. Most of these students were kept at home for 2 years, and in fact, that is one of the reasons why the Iraqi government had to force the liberation of Mosul down, because during the first year, the curriculum that ISIS chose was the standard Iraqi curriculum. The second year, they developed their own. Really scary. And we had to do all we could to prevent them from continuing to indoctrinate young populations. And then, actually just yesterday, Eastern Mosul concluded its first football tournament. I mean, if you know Iraq well, you know this is a really big deal.
Important test.
So stabilization is really important. And this is something that a lot of people are talking about and thinking about. One example I would like to mention is a parliamentarian from Mosul called Farah. Now she did a survey of all reconciliation efforts that have been carried out across the world. And she came up with a plan to prevent retaliatory killing by canvassing the whole city and setting up a system whereby people would receive vouchers that would put them on the appropriate track, with incentives for them to stay on this track to avoid them from taking justice into their own hands. So, for example, if you've been subjected to egregious, violations like murder or rape, then it would be judicial. If it's less than that, you'd be compensated. If it's less than that, then some ombudsman or something like that. So that there's a lot of thinking going on this, but clearly we will need resources, as the Prime Minister pointed out already 2 years ago, to rebuild. And here, I think we will, honestly, I don't think we'll be able to do that with the resources of the Iraqi government. We will need the help of the international community, and first and foremost of our neighbors. It is, with great satisfaction that we see that there is a rapprochement between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And if we could open the doors to individuals to come and invest, individuals from the Gulf to come and invest in Mosul. There's a peculiarity about there's a Arab countries are linked. We still have tribes, very important. One of them, for example, is the Shamar tribe. It spans the range from Saudi Arabia all the way to Syria, and their summer capital is Mosul. And there are a lot of wealthy citizens in Saudi Arabia who could help invest, and perhaps we could engender some sort of healthy competition between our neighbors, the Turks, the Emiratis, the Saudis to help, and even the Iranians.
Yeah. So that's exactly the right direction that we should wrap up our one-on-one conversation before we invite our colleagues to join us. So I think the reintegration of Iraq into the Arab system has been, I think, a long-standing American objective. I mean, we think that the Arab world needs Iraq as a healthy member of the Arab system, and there's been a big question.
But the truth is, they've quarantined us.
Okay, fair enough. That's been the recent history, and as a consequence, I mean, there's many different ways to say this, but some people believe that the U.S. intervention essentially handed Iraq to Iran on a silver platter, or that there are other ways in which Iran was able to exploit and benefit from its close ties once a Shia majority government came into power in Baghdad.
Well,
so I want to give you a chance to talk about how does the Iraqi state look at its relations with Iran Do you see it as part of a balancing act between Iran and other outside actors, or is there a special quality to the Iraq-Iran relationship? Help us understand, because I know our panel will want to talk about this as well.
Oh, there is a special quality in our relationship with Iran. I think we make better Iranian food than the Iranians. No, but the truth is, I mean, Iran is a neighboring country with which we have ties immemorial. Okay, 1,400 kilometers of common borders. Iran is a source of revenue for Iraq through religious tourism, and there is a conscious decision in Iran that we will not be part in any axis against anybody. We've been there, we've done that. It's been a disaster for us. I mean, the demise of the troubles in Iraq really became to crude and affected the whole country with the Iran-Iraq war. God even knows how many Iraqis died in this war, and it was for nothing. So we're not going to participate in axis against this country or that. Not our thing. We'd like to be sort of an attractor, like I said, get people to compete in positive ways. Iran has influence there, and that's absolutely natural and normal. Okay. Do they have authority? No. Otherwise, for example, we would not have signed the SOFA agreement with the United States, for example. The only person who has anything close to a veto on Iraqi issues is Ayatollah Sistani. Okay. And everybody agrees that he is the most Iraqi of us all. Actually, I've met him, and I've met a lot of impressive people. He's the person I've been most impressed with. So we're in a phase where we're trying to attract our neighbors. Like I said, I mean, what we've suffered from is an absence of Arab involvement. Okay. We want countries to be engaged with Iraq in all sorts of ways, whether Arab or otherwise.
Great, thank you. Wonderful beginning, and now we have a distinguished panel to explore the different aspects, both perhaps picking up on some of the themes that Ambassador Yassin has raised, but also bringing in some other angles, particularly a deeper look at what are the options for the United States. We're going to begin with Richard Burchell, who is the Director of Research for Trends, and he has been our collaborator on previous occasions. He speaks on international law, terrorism, and human rights, previously worked at the UN and in various academic positions. So, Richard, why don't you just continue the conversation from a regional perspective, since you are resident in Abu Dhabi and work for a UAE organization. I think it would be helpful to bring the perspective of the Gulf region to the conversation of Iraq's future and the future of stability in the region. So welcome. And
yeah, thanks very much, Ellen, and to Stimson as ever for the partnership. It's always enjoyable. Ambassador, thank you for coming. I must admit, I'm looking at my notes, you've covered most of the points already. But I'll sort of come over some of the ground and offer a few ideas that I know my colleagues will be able to develop even further. I mean, you made the key point at the end. I mean, Iraq is part of the region. It needs regional support. We need cooperation from everybody, both inside and outside. Now, one of the difficulties when looking at Iraq in the last 20 or 30 years, and it's an example on how not to do it. The dangers of foreign intervention, the dangers of focusing primarily on a military, we achieved victory, mission accomplished, and then walking away. This is a horrendous case study, what the Iraqi people have gone through because of poorly thought out military campaigns for questionable political reasons, as well as competition with the neighbors pursuing their own divisive agendas, and essentially we're looking at a very bad situation beyond any doubt. Looking at it from a regional perspective, I mean, the ambassador said the key issue is we need to rebuild. We need to find ways to rebuild. We need to focus on the human element in Iraq. I think too much focus is on, again, the military. You have particular leaders, you have states, neighbors in the region, Iran in particular, focusing on their own self-interested goals and objectives, this access of something. And that's not beneficial to the people on the ground. So we need to get away from that. But of course, in the current circumstances with Daesh, ISIS, that's very difficult to overcome. Hopefully, we're going to see this military victory over this organization. But the ideological impact is going to take a long time to address. From my observations of the situation, the hatred that has come up in the last 10 or 15 years and has really been personified in many respects by Daesh is, I don't know, just as an outside observer, it just looks almost impossible. It's no longer that people just dislike each other, but people have just categorized each other and said, you just don't exist as a human being. I'm not even going to respect you at the most basic level because you belong to this affiliation or that affiliation. And that's not a constructive way to get any sort of conversation going. We got to find a way again to get Iraq back for Iraqis. To see themselves not as Shia, Sunni, Kurdish, but to see each other as benefiting and being part of a national identity. Now I know there's a lot of conversation. States throughout the region were created by Western powers, the Sykes-Picot Treaty, redraw the borders. That's not going to work. We know that's not going to work. It's very difficult. So let's stop talking about breaking up Iraq into 3 different pieces, breaking Syria up into multiple pieces. Let's work with what we have in a constructive way. Now, the way forward, as I see it for Iraq, we need, and this is where the region can play a role in both ways. We need to look at the top, the leadership. Leadership needs to be pursuing a more cooperative national identity. Instead of, again, looking at their own political benefits, looking to be clients of other interests, let's work together. But as well as focusing on the grassroots element. I mean, the ambassador covered many of the points that I already had. Rebuilding the economy, focusing on education are absolutely key issues. And this is stuff you can do right now. Now, I know the operations against Daesh are counterinsurgency, then it becomes counterterrorism, then it becomes a stabilization issue. And yes, we need the military security element to address all those issues. But right now, you can start building on the grassroots. Education is the first point. I mean, your point about girls going to school in Mosul, absolutely. Women have proven in conflict situations to be the leaders on rebuilding society. Let's be supportive of that. Let's make sure we get into that and actively engage with it. Turning individuals into entrepreneurs, local entrepreneurship, local jobs. This helps with the demand for resources, of getting people, again, involved, engaged with it. It provides people with a sense of ownership, a sense of pride. With a large amount of displaced people, and you don't want people leaving, you want people to stay, of course. And you want your best, and you're educated, and you're talented to stay. So the investment issue for the region is a particular issue. At the Arab League Summit, the Prime Minister for the UAE spoke to Prime Minister about getting inward investment going. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, good opportunities. Not just in the sort of generic investment, but these are countries that have built major infrastructures. So the housing issue, we can get going there. Plus, it's a lot closer. And it's the reintegration of Iraq into the Arab world will become important, not just for Iraq, but for the wider region as well. We have huge amounts of resources. People still don't know the size of the oil reserves. People are now guessing it is going to be the largest when we get the technology, the infrastructure rebuilt. So that's a great opportunity. But also a diversified economy is necessary as well. So let's not just turn into a resource-based state. And again, we can see states in the region providing experience, providing opportunities on how to go about doing this. We're hopefully going to see security coming to Iraq with the defeat of Daesh. We then need to work on issues of stability. Clearly, in that one, we need partnership, not just in the region, but with the wider world. but primarily within the region as well. It has to be a proper partnership. You can't have, as we have now, your neighbor essentially saying, it's our state. Iran just saying, Iraq's ours. It's part of the axis of resistance, it's all ours. That's not the most constructive cooperation in public statements. The reality on the ground, but hearing it continually as we do in the region, it's not very good. At the same time, getting the other states in the region to cooperate, work with the United States as well, and this is a key issue for the security in the region that we haven't been seeing over the years. The U.S. should work with its regional partners. It needs to have a discussion with everybody on the ground. These states are very close to Iraq. They see what's happening. They're part of the experience. Work with your neighbors on the ground. And it's in these areas of bringing about stability, and stability that allows us for sustainability. Now, that might seem quite optimistic, but the potential is there. If we focus on the grassroots, we focus on the ground, getting people back to this sense of ownership in Iraq, instead of the ideas of hatred and division, and then we could see some potential going. And as I said, the region provides some good models to follow and can be there for advice and support.
Thank you, Richard. We're going to turn next to Jay Solomon, who's the Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent to the Wall Street Journal, has covered foreign affairs from most of the continents of the world, maybe not Latin America, but virtually everywhere else. But most recently, his notoriety has been an important book that was published, I think, in 2016, The Iran Wars, Spy Games, Bank Battles, and the Secret Deals that Reshaped the Middle East. So I know Jay has been thinking a lot about this sometimes, problematic triangle of the U.S., Iran, and Iraq, of how these three countries bump into each other, and how the U.S. may be starting out on one path and ends up on another. So I hope that you can bring that kind of geopolitical perspective to how we all think about Iraq's role in the region. So,
Great.
Thanks, Jay.
Well, thanks, Ellen, for having me, and to Stimson Center. In researching this book and writing it over the past couple of years, definitely a big part of it, which I was trying to answer, and I don't know if I still have the answer, is what was the Bush administration really thinking when they invaded Iraq? Because there was even at that time, there was so much concern about Iran, such a desire to push Iran back, and this kind of, I was a lot less engaged on the issue back then, but through this book and going back and researching it, watching some of the Iraqi officials who were welcomed in the White House or who had met senior Bush administration officials in the months heading into the war, a lot of them were Shia leaders who had lived in Iraq, who were financed by the Revolutionary Guard to some extent. So it was pretty interesting going back and looking who we were starting to make friends with, and kind of understand who did they think these guys, where were they really going to put their interest going forward. And one of the more interesting archives I read in researching the book were some of the files the U.S. Pentagon captured from Saddam Hussein's intelligence bureaus in the months leading up to the invasion of 2003. And you can see a lot of the Iraqi intelligence services were more concerned in some ways about what the Revolutionary Guard, the Badr Corps, some of their proxies inside Iraq were going to do, as much as what the United States was doing. So there was this real tension from the very beginning, and I don't think the Bush administration ever really came to some sort of real conclusion on how they were both going to remove Saddam Hussein and push back Iranian influence, because you could see immediately after Saddam's fall, kind of this rush of Iranian-supported groups, from businessmen to religious groups to spies to military officials. It was not, some of it was just natural, as the ambassador was saying. This is a Shia country, they have business, they have economic ties, that's gonna happen, but also some of the more nefarious types went in very quickly. And this is a tension, I think, that it wasn't addressed really under the Bush administration, it wasn't addressed under Obama, and it could get worse under the Trump administration, but this desire still to work with the Iraqi government to stabilize Iraq, but also this desire to push Iran back, to confront them, I think Under Obama, in a lot of ways, you kind of went in a direction where, with the nuclear agreement, there was a lot of engagement with Iran, and I think, in some ways, I know this was controversial because the White House never said it, but there was this, in Syria, there was a reluctance to get involved and to push back against Iranian or Assad, the regime's interest because of the nuclear deal, that there was so much invested in this, you didn't want to have a direct conflict there or it would hurt the other. So I do think there was some relationship between the Obama administration's unwillingness to get involved and their desire for this agreement. And in Iraq too, there was, in some ways, you had this interesting dynamic where the US was supporting Iraqi military, which was aligned with Iranian-backed groups, but the US was still on some level saying they were going to push back. So I think this tension has not been resolved, and as others were saying, it's going to be hard for Iraq or that region to sort of stabilize when you still have all of this friction going on. And looking towards the Trump administration, it was interesting, last night they put out a statement very late saying, well, the Iranians are in compliance with its nuclear agreement, which was a bit stunning because Trump was so hostile towards it during the campaign, but at the same time he said he raised the prospect of the U.S. pulling its support for the agreement because of Iran's support for terrorism. And I know if you look at who is staffed on the National Security Council these days, there are a lot of military officers who fought in Iraq, who have a very bad taste in their mouth because of the role of the IRGC and some of its proxies in shipping munitions and IEDs into Iraq, the targeting of U.S. forces by some of these militias. So, I think there's a sense of the desire for real pushback by the Trump administration. Maybe the nuclear deal survives, but in other arenas, whether it's shooting missiles at the Assad regime or in the Persian Gulf, where we've seen the U.S. kind of upping support for the Saudi-backed coalition that's fighting the Houthi militia in Yemen, and potentially in Iraq. I think this tension I've described that goes back now more than 15 years hasn't been addressed, and I think I don't see much hope yet that it's going to there's going to be some alignment and these various interests are addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Jay, Ambassador, I'll put you on notice that one of the questions for you should be if there's a serious uptick in tension in U.S.-Iran relations, how does Iraq manage that? We'll hold that for a little bit later, but does Iraq want to be a mediator in U.S.-Iran relations? So there's different scenarios of how U.S.-Iran relations will play out under the Trump administration, and what does that pose? Does that pose challenges for Iraqi interests? But I'm really delighted now to turn to my comrade here at the Stimson Center. Link was the chairman of Stimson from 2005 till very recently. He's returned as a distinguished fellow. He has many interests and connections to national security policies, served in government in a number of capacities. His most recent job in government was both as Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs in the George W. Bush administration, and even after that, Special Envoy for Man-Path Threat Reduction. So Link brings a breadth of interest and knowledge and experience. He has deep interest in Iran and U.S.-Iran relations, but looks broadly at the U.S. political military engagement in the Middle East. So I really look forward to your reflections on how we should be thinking about this, both how do we engage and help Iraq, how do we manage the Iran challenge, and how would you pull those things together? What do you see as promising prospects for America's engagement in the region?
Well, thank you, Ellen. It's a thrill to be able to have a conversation with you on this podium rather than working on finances in the back room, and happy to have Brian manage it so well. I want to thank Dr. Al-Hamli and the Trend Center. It's wonderful to have you here, and Richard, and your team, and Ambassador Yassin. It's an honor to sit on the podium with you as my guest. I think everything you've heard is very constructive, and I applaud it. We've just had a transition of government, and leaving personalities of who lost, who's in power. This is the moment when we're supposed to rethink policy and how we do business and tools and lessons learned. And I'm going to try to do that in the most sort of neutral way that I can. But one of my takeaways from years in government in different agencies in the national security space is that we've become very focused on country-by-country specialization. We're very good at managing details and daily events and sort of how to do what's right in front of us. That's what our government is good at. I believe that this is a moment to be a little bit more far-reaching and say, what do we stand for? What is our strategy going forward in sort of broad gauge terms that resonate beyond the Middle East to other regions? What does America stand for? Not how many troops are we willing to deploy or how many billions are we willing to go in debt. Those are secondary questions. And I think that this discussion offers us an opportunity to think in those terms. As we look back on the experience in Iraq, and I was involved in 2003, and I share Jay's concerns and questions, what did we try to do? We wanted to help a unified Iraq find a legitimate constitutional way forward that expressed and protected the rights of all Iraqis, the major ethnic groups, but also the small ethnic groups as well, and religious groups, and to give them a functioning state and a way to use their own resources to support it. And I think what you heard from Pastor Yassin tells us that that flame is still burning, that desire is still there. Everything he said was so constructive, and we should continue to aspire to that. But as we look back, we see that it didn't work out so well so far under both Republican and Democratic administrations. I would say we supported leading politicians, not just the ones Jay mentioned, but a prime minister. We stood behind someone who wasn't an Iranian, surrogate, but was a nationalist in some respects. But I think we very much overlooked how much influence Iran had, even through the office of the prime minister. As we supported the Iraqi military, and we did a lot of arms sales on a large scale, we overlooked some important things that we have not overlooked with other countries, and I was the Arms Transfer Authority. We have videos and films showing them using our Humvees and elite units to kill innocent and unarmed exiles living in Iraq, and even an elite hit team that conducted an assassination on September 1st, 2013. So there were a few attacks which should have automatically triggered an Arms Export Control Act review. And if it were Indonesia, we would have suspended arms deliveries for years. That's just a fact. And we did. I was the one that reopened the tap for C-130s after the Banda Aceh tsunami. We would have had a Leahy human rights review and known the individuals involved who were very well connected. And one has been accused of war crimes by the Spanish government. One has been turned away from the European Parliament at the door. We've done nothing in that regard. So we need to sort of heal that wound. And the Pentagon, in sort of pulling our combat forces out of Iraq, promoted the idea of building partner capacity. And in June of 2014, when Mosul fell, there was a fight as ISIS was moving through Mosul, and a large group of the Iraqi military essentially walked away from their Abrams tanks, their Humvees, a lot of equipment. I was at a public conference with the combatant commander, and I asked the 4-star, what did we just see? If you're talking about building partner capacity, what was that? And his honest answer was, if soldiers don't feel that the government is standing for their communities, they won't fight for them. That was an honest answer. It was the right answer. We can move past that, but we have to understand how Iraq can be put back together in a way that's legitimate, where the funds go toward public purposes and can be tracked. In this day and age, it's hard to see Congress helping to write checks to Iraq if they feel that oil money is going through other doorways. We want to support the military, particularly now that they're fighting for their own country, but we need to know that vice presidents can't veto good Sunni commanders because they're Sunni. And so what's really happening here? Let me pivot and talk about the region. And part of this is just what I'm hearing from traveling in the region. I'll just summarize and say that there are 10 named IRGC-supported Iraqi Shia militias in Iraq alone, 10, and smaller subsets of those. There are probably, by my count, 19 Shia militias in 9 countries in the region and the Palestinian area. The number from the U.S. military authority in Baghdad is 80,000 Iranian commanded forces that are not government forces in Iraq alone, 80,000. The number in Syria is unknown, but the estimates run as high as 70,000 on the Iranian payroll. More Iranian commanded troops on the ground in the fight for Aleppo and Idlib than Syrian ground forces, because they don't trust the army, or they can't field the army. They can bomb from the air along with the Russians, but it's the Iranians who are on the ground. As you see these children pulled from the rubble, they are there. And in Yemen, of course, Secretary Mattis has just told us that there are IRGC people tending to ballistic missiles, upwards of, say, 48 on the Saudi border, and firing them into Saudi Arabia, ballistic missiles by the IRGC. So you look at this and say, that's not something that President Rouhani seems to have any say over. It's a pretty big franchise, and it's a lot of money. Where's the money? And I won't go into that except to say that we now know there are 14 major economic sort of holding companies in Iran, most of them under the Supreme Leader's religious foundation, but some that were given to the IRGC in 2005 in what appears to have been a defensive move by the Supreme Leadership to build a domestic constituency against public disaffection. So there are major problems for people trying to do business with Iran. The Europeans have signed many deals. The Americans haven't, because they will be indicted for dealing with front companies that go back to the IRGC and to the Supreme Leader's foundations. So Rouhani doesn't appear to control the money and the economy either. But Reuters has said that upwards of 80% of the Iranian economy is under the control of the Supreme Leader and the military, the Rev Guards and whatnot. So it's the Velayat-e Faqih and not the sort of the government. And even the Foreign Service. I've sort of inquired and I've received some information which I can share and can't validate, but people who follow these things closely have pointed out all of the Revolutionary Guard and Quds Force commands around the Middle East and around the world, the Caucasus, Africa, North and South America, under brigadiers of the Quds Force. They have an information command. So you ask yourself, what does the president and the foreign minister control? The ambassador in Iraq is a Quds Force brigadier general. His predecessor was a Quds Force brigadier. And so, I look at the Washington agencies, and they're dealing with these very urbane and sort of effective interlocutors, but they don't have any equivalent power to the U.S. government. So what is the game that the Middle East is worried about with Iran in Iraq? And I would say it's not Daesh, it's the death of Ayatollah Sistani. Because when he does not follow the Supreme Leadership of Iran, he has rejected the religious authority of the Supreme Leadership. And when he passes, he'll be 87 this year, you can predict that, as Jay just said, there will be a lot of religious pilgrims. Who else will they be? And I think that going back to Ayatollah Khomeini's vision for the revolution, if they can sort of assert control economically over the holy sites of Najaf and Karbala, this will be an enormous victory. And then when Ali Khamenei passes from the scene, and he allegedly is ill, and you see this younger cleric, Raisi, in his 50s running for president with the blessing of the Supreme Leader, this may be the next, this may be a charismatic young new Supreme Leader. Are we just going to sit back? And of course in America we don't have the tools to do much about it, but this is what the Gulf is talking about, is a brand new life for the Supreme Leader's Shia authority. And if you go to Saudi Arabia, you hear about funerals in the eastern province where demonstrations provoked by Iran are trying to accelerate sectarian tensions, where the Saudis are claiming that Shia are reaching much higher levels of government and participation, and they're highly offended by the sectarian threat. This may be true in the UAE as well. And so I remember, Ellen, when we were in Damascus in 2009, we met with Bashar al-Assad. He said a fuse has been lit, a sectarian fuse between Shia and Sunni that's going to burn us all. That's what he said. Now, of course, he helped by opening the jails and the borders and letting all these people flood in to kill Americans and ultimately to become Daesh. He had a hand in it with the connivance of Iran. So, finally, let me summarize by saying, if I come back to my initial comment, and I think, what is Washington's strategic objective here? In Syria, in Iraq, even in Iran, if we admit it, in Libya, in Yemen, our aspiration, if not our overt policy goal, is to have a functioning, legitimate government that's peaceful, that doesn't threaten its neighbors, that can support itself and focus on economics, education, women's rights, all of these things which are really generational, happening in the Middle East, inexorably. We may not sort of put a dagger in the table and say that's our policy and we're going to enforce it, but we can't enforce it militarily. We can't afford it economically. I don't think we can sanction our way into coercing people. So the tools that are at play here are different, and they probably involve a lot more information, a lot more media, a lot more religious activity that's really not ours to do more than to encourage from the sidelines. But it's time to sort of notice that if Iran has an election and hasn't allowed more than 2% of the candidates who filed for the presidency ever to stand on the ballot since Bani Sadr in 1981 when he was impeached, we have to notice that it's not correct. For 20 years it's been 2%. It's been no more than 4% since Bani Sadr. So is this a democracy? Are we going to applaud and congratulate whoever wins the next election in May? Are we going to sit back after Sistani dies and watch all sorts of people flood into Najaf and Karbala as if we don't know what's happening? Why do you think the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia made a trip to southern Iraq for the first time in 27 years? That's why. There's your answer. So there's a very important struggle going on that has more to do with implied authority, sectarianism, and essentially the future of the region on a very large scale. And I think it behooves the Americans, not just the cabinet level, but people below the cabinet level, to be allowed to think much more strategically about this and to think outside the box and not just think military and sanctions, but what do we really do about this? When we were faced with a communist empire and Soviet threat, we didn't say let's blow up Moscow. We said let's avoid escalation, and we were much more clever about trying to influence the outcome. I think that's where we are today.
Thank you, Link. I expected something very broad and geopolitical, and that's just what we got.
Sorry.
So what I'd like, no, it's terrific. It's a very compelling and sort of powerful expose of how to think about the Iranian threat, over time, and what some of the limits of U.S. capacity to influence and change the situation. So, Ambassador Yassin, Iraq is only one of the countries that is perhaps vulnerable to this level of Iranian influence. And you made a couple of points earlier that Iraqis care about their own national sovereignty and identity, that the popular mobilization militias are being over time dismantled and integrated into national forces. But I want to give you a chance to speak to some of the other issues about how vulnerable is Iraq to an Iran that has great ambition in the region. Proximity, you are particularly exposed because of proximity, but this question of Najaf and Karbala and whether, post-Sistani, is Iraq worried about a different channel for Iran to influence the events in Iraq. So if you want to comment on any other things that the other panelists said, but I want to start with that issue.
I want to start with an anecdote
Okay.
about Iraq not being disrupted. In 1992, I went to a physics colloquium at MIT, given by a guy called Jay Davis. Some of you maybe know him. He was the inspector in the UN inspection team that had the nuclear expertise. Okay. And normally, those lists of inspectors didn't mention the specializations. Unfortunately for him, his specialization was leaked, and he therefore could no longer travel outside the United States. So he could no longer work as an inspector, so he started talking about this at universities and offering, interesting stories and examples of future jobs for physicists. And he gave a really impressive discussion of the nuclear effort that was carried out under Saddam. I hate Saddam, but I was pretty proud of what they had achieved, in terms of technical achievements. But his last comment was the one that I'd like to relate to you. He said that if the Iraqis show as much resolve and intelligence in running their country and applying good principles of governance and democracy,
as they had shown in their nuclear effort, there would be a far more disruptive force in the Middle East. And actually, we do aspire to that. But I'd like to go back to what you said, sir, about there being people in Iran who exclude the others. The only ideology that is exclusionist is Daesh's, and that is going to be dealt with. These guys, as you have seen, kill to kill. They kill on identity, and that is no longer going to be, they won't be allowed to do that anymore. Our strategic interest is to avoid that Iraq become a battlefield. I collect old maps in the 17th and 18th centuries, and you see the border between the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire, so go back and forth across Iraq. We don't want that to happen. And so one of the things we really want to do is to bring in greater bits onto the area. And for example, much was spoken about the nuclear deal. I want to remind you that one of the rounds leading to the nuclear deal was held in Baghdad with the support and encouragement of the Iraqi government. And in fact, my view of this JCPOA is that it is much closer to Helsinki rather than to SALT. It's about politics. It's about getting people to sit down at the table and use other means of settling disputes than the military race. On Ayatollah Sistani, I pray for him every day. But Sistani is not only a person, it's a school of thought, and it is pervasive in Najaf. Most of the major Ayatollahs, including people who might likely be his successor, follow his school of thought. Nobody, the interesting thing about Iraqi politics is whenever we have elections, we never know who the next prime minister is going to be. It's always been like that since the regime change. But by the same token, we really don't know who the next Ayatollah is going to be. Because most Iraqis hope that it will be someone who will formerly be on the school of Ayatollah Sistani. Like I said, it's an incredible presence.
But on let me just ask you to address one more issue. This notion that it's the IRGC that dominates most of the institutional relationships with Iraq, whether it's military or diplomatic, etc. Does anybody worry about that in Baghdad? Do they think there's any way they can push back and try to ever deny an ambassador being named because they want less IRGC influence, less IRGC presence in the country?
That's a question about internal Iranian politics. We deal with them as a neighboring country, as an actually friendly country. And we would not, I think, turn down a proposed ambassador from Iran, as we would not turn down an ambassador from any other country. Let me paraphrase what one very prominent Iraqi politician said. He said that Iraq has something that we have to maintain good relationships with the axis of evil and the great Satan. And that's something that is a consequence of both history and geography. And this is one of the reasons why we have tried, much as we could, to bring the rapprochement between the United States and Iran, other than the meeting with the nuclear negotiations that was held in Baghdad. I actually sat in a meeting where Ryan Crocker met with Iranian diplomats in 2007, 2008, and actually one of the things I'm going to put in my memoirs is that I got Muttaqi to shake hands with Feldman, which she graciously did. So it is in our interest to bring in a detente to the area, and I think one of the ways to do that is to talk to people and tell them, look at your interests. Forget about ideology. Look at your interests. And there are objective reasons, for people to sit down. Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, have an interest in maintaining dialogue process.
that's something to get people to sit down, talk and work together with. And it is in our interest to get people to tamp down the level of tension. And it is in our interest because, like I said, one should get rid of ideology, but it is in our interest, in everybody's interest, for us to get together, and I'm speaking here of the region and of Muslim countries in the region, to address the issue of extremism and violence and discourse that is problematic and is, to my mind, unislammic.
Thanks, thank you. I want to invite any of the three of you to comment on each other or on anything the ambassador has raised that you'd like to add to your remarks, and then we're going to open the floor in a few minutes.
I mean, the one element that hasn't been raised, and I thought that was a great overview, is how Russia's role might now be impacting not Syria, Iraq. As a journalist, you read or you see that I think one of the more disturbing parts of covering the Iran nuclear talks were that there was a hope kind of behind the scenes that the Iranians and the Russians were going to help out more in Syria once this agreement was put in place. We now know the Russians and the Iranians were having secret talks behind our back to enact this joint military operation inside Syria, which has stabilized the Assad regime to some extent, and now they talk of Iraqi, Iranian, Syrian intel center in Baghdad. I don't know how much it's true, but there is this other element of the Russians working with the Iranians, working with the Syrians, trying to spread their influence even further. And to me, that's another dynamic that we didn't touch on. That's kind of new, very new.
Yeah, I think the key point that you made at the very end there, and trying to proceed without the emphasis and use and abuse of ideology is going to be the most difficult challenge. When I made the point that the impact of Daesh is going to be for a long time, it's because of the way religion has been politicized to such a degree. It's become an ideology for some people, and trying to get people out of that mode of hatred is a very difficult process. It's difficult in Europe, it's difficult in the United States, it's very difficult for a situation in Iraq. And really the only way to do that is to get people to have this sense of belonging. You got to show them that they're somehow worthwhile, because if they're still insecure, if they're still vulnerable, others can easily prey on it, be it the local militias, be it another country, your next door neighbors. And we need to see, or what we're seeing in the region right now across Syria and Iraq, is this fragmentation of interests and powers. People that are not necessarily trying to work with a higher power, but they're working very locally and spreading this hatred. And they're willing to essentially, stand their ground to the death over this little bit of space, because they think their ideology is the only way to survive. So getting beyond the ideology and looking at an economic future, sustainability, stability, basic things, I know. But it's going to be the huge step on how we overcome that ideology. And again, this goes back to your key point. It's going to be a collective partnership where it's in everybody's interest to find a way forward that's cooperative and not sort of based on hatred. So it's going to be key point, but key struggle.
Can I just say something about the way the U.S. does business? I'm struck by the fact that we tend to look through the telescope in Washington, and it's all about the other guys, as if what we do is perfectly natural and perfectly effective. And I think this is a time to be a little bit more questioning of that. We've been burned in the Middle East in the last several years in both parties. And I mean, the pivot to Asia, I remember in meetings in Tokyo in the last couple of years where the assumption was we're going to spend much more focus in Asia. And my answer was not until your cabinet is going to be stuck in the Middle East, until things get better. They will be crisis managing, and maybe the second tier will go to Asia. So the problem here is that if you're sort of nervous about putting the president in a position of promising things that we can't deliver, you end up being very incremental and minimalist and small ball about policy. And whereas, as Richard's comment I think reflects, you need to paint a horizon that says this is an aspiration that we share. And Ambassador Yassin has painted part of that horizon, and so has Richard, I think. And that is extremely important, not to say we promise that we'll make it there, but that we're with you in that journey. And so then people aren't just fighting for a little village, they actually think that there's a future. And if you read, for example, the Syrian High Negotiations Committee has a whole program of action that reflects human rights, women's rights, democratization, justice with due process. These are things that the resistance group in Iraq, resistance group in Iran, frankly, in Syria, people in Yemen believe that this problem can be mediated if the war doesn't go on for another year. So there's a lot riding on diplomacy, conflict resolution, and having a vision of the future that is aspirational. One word on the media. I'm proud to sit next to the Wall Street Journal because I think they maintain an extremely high standard at a time when media is going through a lot of self-reflection, and I think self-improvement, frankly. But I find that reporters won't print something until they get it confirmed by the U.S. Embassy overseas or by the State Department or by, and no offense to my friends in the government, but by the time an embassy can confirm something, the rest of the region's known it for months, if I may put it that way. And so I want to urge the U.S. media, as it sort of takes umbrage at some of the rocks that have been thrown at it, to be bold and tell us what you're hearing. Put it in some caveat, but tell us what you think you know, because we need to hear it in Washington. That's how think tanks take the media. They write about it. It gets reflected in government policy analysis. I think that there's a lot of, what's the word, it's a very sclerotic system right now. We need to sort of clear out the membranes and get some ground truth from our high-end media. And so be bold, tell us what you're hearing. This is what I'm doing. I just float around the region talking to people and try to decide what I think is credible. So I don't speak for anyone, but I'd like to see Stimson be able to look at major media and say, I'm hearing a lot of indicators on the ground. What's really happening in Syria? What's really happening in parts of Iraq? And what's happening in Iraq?
I just want to comment on the media, if I may. Thank you for that. That's a really critical point. One of the good legacies of the United States in Iraq is that we now have a very vibrant media. Some of our journalists were trained by the likes of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. Some of their actually Iraqi staffers ended up being Newman Fellows. And when the owner of the Washington Post sold his paper, he gathered everybody around to tell them why he was selling it to Jeff Bezos. The first person he recognized was Iraqi, of course. But the other group, right afterwards, was a group of Iraqi journalists working for the Washington Post. My comment here is addressed to the editors. Please trust your journalists on the ground, because they know much more about the area than you do. And let them have more to say in what gets published.
So that's a perfect segue, because we want to give a chance for any journalists in the room to ask the first round of questions before we turn to others. I want to acknowledge that I'm delighted that the representative of the Kurdish regional government is here, and so we've, in talking about sectarianism, we've a little bit neglected more attention to relations between Baghdad and Erbil. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that before the session is over.
Hi. I'm Namo Abdullah with Ghouda, it's a Kurdish news agency. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to Washington. I want you, if you can, comment on the latest dispute between Baghdad and Erbil over Kirkuk. Where does that dispute stand now over the raising of the Kurdish flag? And do you see it as a potential roadblock for Iraq after ISIS as it tries to put its home together? Thank you.
That's an internal Iraqi issue, and I won't comment on that.
Are you a journalist?
Yeah.
Okay, please.
Aswad Jabbar, Kurdish writer and journalist. I'm working in VOA, Voice of America, Kurdish service. I have a question about the corruption. You don't explain say more about the corruption in Iraq, entire of Iraq, not just the Kurdistan region, and all the Iraq has a big problem of corruption. And the corruption is when you fight in ISIS, fighting terrorists, you can fight by military fighting, but how you can fight the corruption, kill the people by the economic situation. Yeah.
Anybody want to address corruption? Are there any reforms underway?
Thank you for asking this question. This is a key issue, and corruption is bleeding Iraq and bleeding its population, and it's at all levels. And what I can tell you is that the Iraqi government is quite aware of this, and not only the Iraqi government, but all our partners, whether they're international organizations or friendly governments, are helping us and urging us to take action on it, and we are. Just last week, there was a huge conference organized by UNDP to address this issue, attended by a former Inspector General of Stu Bowen, I don't know if you know.
The Special Inspector General for Iraq.
So it's a key issue, and I think we won't find a way forward, and we won't be able to deliver the services we need to deliver to our citizens without addressing that issue. And the interesting thing is, most politicians are now aware of it. A prominent politician, I won't say from which part of the country, told me that he was thinking of developing a platform, an electoral platform, that would address the kinds of issues that you're raising, fighting corruption, ensuring good governance, providing services, and things like that, to his own regional constituency, and then going around and shopping at politicians in other parts of the country, so that at some point, once they get elected in Parliament, they might have something of a common platform to create what would become a cross-sectarian, cross-ethnic political platform and a coalition. So the issue is really important, it's dangerous, and thank you for asking.
Can I just say something? This is one where if I could wave a wand over the U.S. government, I would put a very elite team together. I wouldn't call it a corruption effort, because that insults people. You know, do you want to be the target of an advisory effort that implies that you might be corrupt? I'd call it a governance team. But the way we do things, you know, certain bureaus in the State Department, people elsewhere in the Treasury will say, well, that's my issue. And you put a little team together, but what will really happen? We need to design a set of two eyes on the sources of the money and where the money goes. And if we do it well and find technologies and sort of ways of double checking, this could be a tool that would be effective in a lot of countries, which would be an extremely positive element of hygiene of governance around the world. So I would commend the US government to think about that. I don't talk about corruption because I can't back it up. Because I read something about a corruption commission in Iraq, and the number that I saw was so outsized that I didn't believe it. It was, even I didn't believe that $500 billion could have disappeared. But that, if I'm not mistaken, was the number that came out of an Iraqi corruption commission. Can you verify that?
$500 billion?
$500 billion was the number that I read. That's why I hesitate to
That's a
raise
lot
it.
of money. Probably includes, I don't know. I can't comment on that.
But there was a commission.
But the amounts of money lost to corruption are absolutely staggering.
And just to add to that, if I could, when we're talking about how we're going to rebuild the place, you're right, inward investment is not going to come from anywhere if Iraq just keeps showing up bottom of the transparency index, bottom of the ease of doing business, bottom of effective governance. But the bigger problem that I see from my perspective is that this takes away from your point about the sense of ownership for the citizens on the ground. If you see this corruption at all levels around you, you start saying, well, I'm getting.
If I may, there are things that are being done. One of the things that the government is trying to implement, both in the KRG and also in the federal government, is to bring in elements of e-government, streamlining the process to grant permits and things like that. That cuts down layers and removes areas of potential corruption. There are also efforts carried out to recover assets that we actually very much need. And here, in fact, the UAE, which is in the forefront of setting up e-government in the Arab world, could be helpful to Iraq.
What's the message?
So my experience in looking at both Afghanistan and Iraq is that the U.S. is part of the problem and part of the solution, that we design aid projects that have a lot of accountants and transparency and double checking of who gets access to the money. But more in the case of Afghanistan than Iraq, it was partly the huge infusion of American money that created, or at least exacerbated, corruption problems, and that a lot of the money that gets, stolen or misplaced or in the wrong hands is in fact funds that came from outside the country. In Iraq's case, you've got oil money that
It's the oil for food
that
program.
you can, and the oil for food program. That's right. So, any other questions?
Good afternoon. I'm Tanya Kalmakova, correspondent for Russian news agency RIA Novosti. I have one question to Mr. Ambassador and experts. Russian side is promoting the idea of imposing comprehensive trade and economic embargo on ISIS, and specifically by establishing better border control of Iraq and Syria. And they say that one of the Security Council committees should be responsible for monitoring that. Does this idea sound realistic to you? Is that something that Iraq government or American might support or not? Thank you very much.
I can't comment because I'm not aware. I don't know more about this. Maybe I should talk to my colleague at the United Nations. But I think the issue of ISIS in Iraq is something that is going to be resolved in not too long. I hope.
I think the sanctions committees at the UN have, maybe Russia is talking about strengthening some of the existing mechanisms, but I think it's unlikely that the UN members can take on the responsibilities of border security. The most they can do is urge the two countries with their external security partners to improve border security. But certainly that's part of the story of how ISIS gained control of territory between the Turkish, the roots between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq in all directions, of how the ISIS fighters got in and established themselves, is very much about the vulnerability of borders in this region. So it's, in spirit, it sounds like the right idea, but I can't speak to whether the U.S. government or others are ready to endorse it.
Yeah, I mean, I know as a journalist, this has been in tension for the last 4 or 5 years, or 2 or 3 years, certainly. There was a lot of attempts to get the Turks to seal the border with Iraq. Didn't really happen, and that was at the time there was a lot of very public criticism that Turkey wasn't doing enough to cutting off the funds going into ISIS from Sunni elements inside Turkey and elsewhere, and I think that tension is still there, and it's hard to implement that or enforce it from the UN. It's got to be done by the Turkish military or the U.S. military, and I think that tension has not gone away.
Last question?
Hello, I'm Patrick Hickey with the U.S. Government Accountability Office. And Mr. Ambassador, I just wanted to follow up on some of the question you raised about a potential demobilization of Iraqi security forces after the ISIS crisis passed. In particular, by legalizing the status of the Shia militias within the Popular Mobilization Force, have you not bestowed upon them a national security mission, and therefore they are now eligible for coalition training and assistance? And I'd like you to comment on that. And also, what would a post-ISIS Iraqi military look like? Will there be an ongoing role for the Popular Mobilization Forces? Will you revive the idea of creating a regionally based National Guard, which I understand was a Iraqi initiative a few years ago, which is sort of stillborn now?
I'll tell you what I think. Okay, this is not necessarily Iraqi government policy. I think what's going to happen with the mobilizations is after the threat of ISIS is over, the great majority of their members will revert to civilian life. They may get a pension, and that might impose a certain strain on the Iraqi budget. But I think most of them, the great majority, is going to retire. In terms of our military, my favorite solution that I'd like to throw in there is to reintroduce national conscription, like the Swedes just did. This will be a national process that would include everybody. We could work out models of military service that could ensure that the military reflects the nature of the population, like the Swiss and the Finns do. But that's above my pay grade. But I think that's a solution that should be thought about. And maybe our friends at the American government could think about it as well.
Diane, would you like to say anything? Yes? Yes. The microphone down here. The representative of the KRG.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ambassador, and all the panelists, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. One thing that hasn't been mentioned is that the Kurdish leadership has just announced that we intend to hold a referendum on independence this year. How does that fit into all of the things that you talked about?
Any comments?
Show me an example where a smallish state has successfully pursued an independence policy post-conflict, and then we can start discussing. Not the most
Kosovo?
stable places. Kosovo's not even a state.
East Timor?
East Timor, another bad example. This is the tendency in the world today. Let's break everything up into pieces, but it's proving to be ineffective. Everybody says Kurdistan's a different example. It has all the oil, but you have to control all your borders. You have to take care of all of the issues. It's a difficult way forward, and it's not just the local impact it has, but it's the wider impact as well, where we're all saying this, everybody go independent. 20 years ago, self-determination was the answer to everything. But I said, former Yugoslavia, if people try to use as a good example, it's a bad example. Sectarian tensions are continuing to rise, poor economic performance, corruption continues to be an issue, and just the violence and sort of discontentment on the ground is a problem. Even Scotland can't even come up with a decent plan to go independent when they have 2,000 years of history almost behind them. It would be very difficult, and I think it would be counterproductive at this stage, to say, let's create an independent country. As I said at the very beginning of my comments, we always say these borders were drawn by outsiders, they're arbitrary, let's not have them. But where are we going to draw the new borders? Especially when it comes to the situation in the Kurdistan. Is that going to be all Kurds? Is it going to be specific Kurds? Are these groups going to get along, or are these groups going to start fighting themselves? What happens when all of a sudden one group separates and subgroups within that group don't like the situation? Are they going to separate themselves out again as well? I think you need to see much larger pursuit of stability and security before you need to start talking about successionist movements. Self-determination processes within Iraq, absolutely. Recognition of federated situations, absolutely. Recognition of rights for everybody, absolutely. But a complete independent situation, no, not effective.
A quick comment that in the Middle East you have concerns about southern Yemen not potentially sticking with the country. If you had safe zones in Syria, would that end up being a breakaway subset of Syria? I will posit that the best way to keep Syria unified is to proceed with the UN vision for a transition, peaceful transition, where the opposition has said they would incorporate most of the government and the Alawite rank and file of the military and the government would be brought in a way that we didn't do in Iraq after 2003 with the Iraqi army. So I think that one thing that the Kurdish authorities could do is to tell the rest of Iraq, we know what we can do for ourselves. You need to show us how our rights will be protected in the larger Iraq. In other words, this is what it will take, and to motivate them to protect the rights of all. Our definitions of democracy have been, I think, wanting in America, in Washington, as we've gone through one crisis after another. It's not just the holding of elections, as you'll see next month in Tehran. It really is the protection and the assured protection of the rights of minorities within a system. That really turns out to be the more important definition of democratic governance, in my view at least. So the final point is the strategic if you will, lack of clarity in American thinking long term, which is that there is kind of a contest between authoritarianism, even in the media age where media is suppressed, rights are suppressed, all the means of security, transport, and economy are controlled. We see this in major powers in the world. It's very alarming. So what's the alternative? What do we stand for? What was the Arab Spring about? What was the Maidan about? What was Hong Kong demonstrating for, or Malaysia, Venezuela? It's a global phenomenon, and I think that the United States would do well to reassert the sort of governance of states and to recognize what a non-state actor is. So when you talk about the popular mobilization forces, these are non-state actors, whatever kind of patina we've put over them. And the more we sit back and tolerate non-state behavior as if it's perfectly normal, and I'm not speaking about the Kurdish Authority at this point, we are eroding the franchise that started in the 1700s that led to a stable world order. And I think that's the strategic part that we need to rediscover and be more clear about.
About a year or so ago, I was at the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the Somme battle. And I ran into Nicola Sturgeon, who's the Prime Minister of Scotland. So I went over to her and I actually thanked her for her contribution of Scots to Iraq. Most of the engineers that built Iraq under the British were Scottish. And I told her, let me share with you a tweet that was sent by Ben Whelan, a journalist for CNN, I think, quoting an Iraqi politician in the aftermath of Brexit. He said, I never thought that the United Kingdom would break up before Iraq. He's managed it just twice. Look, I actually was anticipating a question like yours, and I wanted to bring my passport with me to show you the name of the Iraqi Republic is written in Arabic and English and Kurdish. And it's the only country in the region that does that. So Kurds in Iraq have rights that they have nowhere else, and they're entitled to them. And people realize that Kurdish independence is an aspiration. I see this as something that is aspirational. Whether it's something that is practical will be determined by many of the arguments that you raised.
It's a profound question. I think the Kurdish future will be an important dimension of how we think about the future of the Middle East. So I think it deserves more attention than we've been able to give it. But I'm very glad we raised it, at least for a minute or two. Our event this morning is going to wrap up with some comments by former Member of Congress Bill Enyart from the 12th District of Illinois. We're happy to welcome you here.
Mr. Ambassador, members of the panel, it's really been a delight to have been invited to appear today to provide some closing remarks, and it's certainly been a great education for me. I feel much like a kid who finished the survey course, and I'm in the presence of the postgraduate doctoral fellows who are educating on this. And before I go any further, I'd really like to commend Mr. Ambassador for promulgating the concept of a GI Bill for the Iraqi military. I think that's a great idea. I've been a benefactor of that, or I've received the benefit of that, I should say. I'd still be working on the welding line at Caterpillar Tractor Company had it not been for the GI Bill, which enabled me to become a journalist, become a lawyer, become a major general, go to Congress, and now serve as an adjunct professor at Lindenwood University in Belleville, Illinois. Now, so I think that's a great idea, and I strongly encourage you to follow up on that. In closing, I think we need to remember, as Shakespeare put it in The Tempest, Antonio said, what's past is prologue. And we're looking at the future, but in order to understand where we are today and where the future will lead, we need to understand the past. And I'd like to comment on Henri Barkey, professor at Lehigh, who in the Washington Post 2 years ago said, the future probably offers chaotic multipolar arrangements where national boundaries are retained, but are crisscrossed, and I'm paraphrasing here, but are crisscrossed by various terrorist groups. It will not be pretty, but we may have to get used to it. Now, why do we have to get used to it? Well, I think one reason is that, as our American military so succinctly puts it, I think for the United States, and here we have the experts on the area, but for the United States, and as Lincoln put it, we've become expert country by country. And here we have the experts on a region of the world. But for the, I think for the American government as a whole, and certainly for the American military, the Middle East is what we call an economy of force mission. Now, what is an economy of force mission? Well, it's kind of like in World War II when Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that we would focus 90% of the effort on Europe, 10% of the effort in the Pacific theater. The Pacific was an economy of force mission. Now, why is that? Because, as the ambassador put it, ISIS is going to be defeated. ISIS is, and Daesh, we prefer to call it, is a relatively minor player. You know, when we look at the world today, and this is from my former seat in Congress, where I sat on the Armed Services Committee, it's from my perspective as a retired Major General, the Middle East is certainly an area of great conflict. But there is no existential threat to the United States of America in the Middle East today, and not in the immediate future. Now, certainly, it creates problems. And as we see, what we've seen develop, of course, now we have Russian interests in Syria, Russian interests with Iran. And I find it interesting that when we talk about the sectarian divide in the Middle East, I find it interesting that the Russians seem to be pretty much aligning with Shia interests, whereas the United States seems to be aligning with Sunni interests. But as long as we have the great powers meddling, we're going to continue to have greater problems there. Now, I think we've got some real complicating factors in the Middle East too, which doesn't give me great optimism. First of all, what's going to happen with oil prices? You know, there was a global 2025 forecast put out in 2008 by the National Intelligence Council, which predicted that oil prices were going to remain high, that the money was going to continue to flow into the Middle East and the other oil-producing countries. Now, unfortunately, that prediction was wrong. And what have we seen happen with oil prices? Well, what are going to continue to happen to oil prices? I'm not about to make any kind of prediction as to what will happen with oil prices. If I could make that prediction, I would be hustling the stock market and investing. But clearly, the volatility of oil is a complicating factor in the Middle East, particularly with the fact that 90% of the government revenue in Iraq comes from oil. So if oil prices stay low, it doesn't bode well. If oil prices skyrocket with the corruption that we've heard talked about, what's going to happen? A couple of other complicating factors we need to keep in mind. Water shortages and climate change. Those have not been addressed at all by any of the major players, and we certainly need to consider that. What will Turkey's role be? How are we going to resolve the Kurdish issues? And it was interesting to hear the questions from the Kurdish representatives in the audience today. Certainly, Turkey's role is a complex a factor that needs to be considered along with that of Iran. Another factor we need to consider, what is going to be the ongoing support of the United States? Now, we need to, let's call it the good, the bad, and the ugly. But let's change it a little bit from the good, the bad, and the ugly to the executive, and we'll call that the will, the legislative, we'll call that the money, and the public interest, or the public at large, we'll call that the durability factor. So, is Congress going to adopt the new AUMF, authorization for the use of military force? Will Congress at some point be asked to do that, as Obama asked the Congress to do? If Congress is asked, what's the response going to be? I think that, I believe it was the ambassador who said that the American military can't solve the problems there. And he's absolutely correct. We cannot solve the problems there. But in order for continued American military involvement there, I think at some point we're going to have to consider whether or not the executive is going to have to ask the legislative for an authorization to continue using military force. And how much more money will the United States be prepared to put in? Now, I thought it was interesting today, particularly that Jay brought up the fact that of Russian involvement, which really has not been discussed very much by the panel today, but I think is of great concern. You know, we saw what happened in Afghanistan over the last century, from the British Empire to the Russians, to us. We're seeing the same conflagration, potential conflagration in the Middle East. And in closing, I thought it was interesting that in today's Wall Street Journal, the Saudi ambassador, Abdullah Assad, in an op-ed piece said, and I'm paraphrasing, that the United States and Saudi Arabia share views of the Middle East situation augurs well for the possibility of bringing stability and peace to the region. And I want to highlight this, but we are in for a long slog. And he went on to say, in the end, it is American power reinforcing and complementing the work of America's allies in the region that will bring stability and lasting peace. And for all of us, I pray for that peace. Thank you.